Welcome to this video in the series teaching C#.NET for engineers. In this video we are going to look specifically at big concepts such as the project types that you can create in Visual Studio and how different project types reference each other. Now I recommend that you have a look at the preceding videos in this series specifically to understand what the objective of this series is and to understand what the prerequisites are. Mainly that you have Visual Studio installed on your computer and that you have watched some of the videos dealing with how to use Visual Studio. So, project categories that you can create in Visual Studio generally fall in two classes. There are those projects that you can run and those projects that you cannot run. So projects that you can run is generally, so when you open up a new project in Visual Studio, and I'll give you a demonstration of this shortly, you're basically going to be confronted in C# with these project type options. And the projects that can run are those that basically compile to an exe file, and that means they can be distributed to users so that they can copy or install those files on their computers, and those projects can also be run from Visual Studio. If you right click on the project and you say set this as a startup project, you can run it and debug into that project. Now, as I showed earlier, this is basically the window, that the panel that confronts you when you create a new project. So those projects that can run is the console app, which we'll mainly be using, and the Windows Forms app, and then also for web you can create an ASP.NET Core Web API. Now there are other project templates also in Visual Studio that are not shown here, and it depends really how you have set up Visual Studio what you will see. But generally in this series we are going to rely a lot on the console app and the class library, and maybe later on we will look into Windows Forms application. So if we look at the projects that you cannot run directly, these projects generally compiles to a file with a DLL extension. So whereas those that can run compile to an exe extension. So projects that cannot run will compile to a DLL file. They can be linked to other projects and they cannot be run from Visual Studio directly. So you can't really set them as a startup project and then run them. So these would be the class library and also the unit test project. So it's also important to understand that within Visual Studio, when you are opening Visual Studio and working with a project, that project will also always fit inside a solution. So when you open Visual Studio, it's going to open up the last solution that you're working with, and that solution will basically contain one or more projects. So it's important to note that projects fits inside a solution. You can have many projects inside a solution. You can have several projects that can run, such as several console apps, and you can have several libraries, and you can link these projects inside a solution to each other in different ways. So when you are opening a new project, you will see this panel. So here I'm creating, for example, a console app. You give the project a name. You select the location where the project will be stored, and notice that this is the default option, that the solution file and the project file will be placed in the same directory. And you can see based on these settings where your project is going to be created, and your solution file, which is just a single file with a .sln extension, will sit in the same folder. Okay, so the next aspect to note is that when you create a project has to be assigned a .NET version. So I recommend that you always use the latest version. So here, for example, I'm using the latest version of Visual Studio. I've recently updated it, and I'm going to use .NET 9 for most of the demonstrations. As I said earlier, you can have multiple projects in a solution, and it's very important that you can always go inside a solution and add and remove projects from that solution. So you can also, within a solution, you can link projects so that one project can use the features in another project. I'll demonstrate that in a moment. So it's important to note that linking a project, one project to another, is referred to as creating a reference from one project to another. So here, for example, I've got one project here, which is my console app, and then I've got a class library. Both of them fit inside this solution, and I can create a reference from this application to my library so that I can use the functionalities in that library. So how do you do that? Basically, you open up the project tree in Solution Explorer. So here you can click on that little arrow and it will unfold here this project. And then inside that you will see it looks like a subfolder, but it's called Dependencies. You right click on Dependencies, select Add Project Reference, and then it will show you the other projects in that solution. And I'll demonstrate that in a moment. So this is what it will look like once you're done. You basically I've got this My App opened up. I've right-clicked on Dependencies. It showed me a list of projects. I selected this one, and I can now see that this app has got a dependency to this library here. And that is really important because it allows you to structure your code. Even when your project gets really big, you can structure your code in a very logical blocks that contain classes and code that specifically refer to one aspect. So for example, your app may be a general engineering app that you write for yourself or for your colleagues to do all sorts of engineering calculations in your field. Maybe you're a bridge engineer or a road engineer, and there's some calculations that you always do, and you want to have a program that can do it. But now you find that your code is growing and growing, and after a while you decide, I want to take all code that pertain to, let's say, GPS or global positioning system calculations, or maybe everything that pertains to mathematical calculations, and I want to put it in one separate container. Then you would take that code and you can then put it in a separate class library which is dedicated to that one topic, and that code you can then share with other projects that you are working on as well. Okay, so let's go into Visual Studio, and I'll quickly demonstrate these concepts. So here I am in Visual Studio, and I'm going to go here, create a new project, and I'm going to create a console app. And I go down here to Next, and I'm going to call this My App, and I'm going to put this in my Z Demos folder. So there I can see where it is going, and I leave this ticked Place Solution and Project in same directory. I click Next, and as I showed you, you select your .NET version. I'm going to select .NET 9. I leave all the other options on their default, and I click on Create. Alright, so now if I go here to Solution Explorer, you can see my app is sitting there, and you can see it sits inside that solution over there. Alright, and here inside of this application, there's one file called program.cs, and that file has been opened here for me. So if you run that, you'll see this console that shows Hello World, and you can press any key to close it. Right. So that's my one project, my console application created inside my solution. Now let's add a class library to this solution. So I click in the solution, I right click, and I go to Add, and I select New Project. And now Visual Studio opens up this project creation workflow for me again. This time I'm selecting class library. I go to Next, and I'm going to call this My Library, and I put it in the same folder. I click Next. Again, I select .NET 9, and I create it. Right, so now in Visual Studio, you can see I've got my two projects here. And if I want to create a reference from my app, remember this is the app that can run. This is a DLL, it cannot run. So let's check that. If I right click on it and I say set as startup project, now my library, my class library is my startup project. And if I run this, I'm going to get this warning. It says a project with output type class library cannot be started directly. All right, so let's undo that. We right click on my app, and we say set as startup project, right? So now you'll often see that if you click on a project, Visual Studio will open this XML document document that contains the properties of the project. And if you're new to Visual Studio, that could be confusing, because you see this and you say, how do I get this? How do I remove this? Well, just look on the right here. You'll see that is temporarily open. You can just close it by clicking on that window, okay, by clicking on that close icon. Let's check that again. If I click on this project, then it will open this, and I can just go to that close icon and close it directly. So now if we go into my class library, you'll see it adds a default class file for you there. Don't worry if you don't know anything about C# classes, what a class is and so on. We're going to discuss that in one of the future videos in detail from the ground up. But for now, that all you need to know is that generally the name of a class will correspond to the file of the class, right? That's not always the case, but generally that's good practice. So I can right click and rename this. So let's rename this as calculator. I'm going to call this a calculator, and you'll see Visual Studio says you are renaming a file. Would you also like to perform a rename in this project of all references to the code element class 1. So it basically says you may have some code in your solution that already refer to class 1. Remember, that's the current name of this class. Do you want us to update your code with this new name, calculator? And generally you will say yes, right? So you can see the file name was changed and the name of the class was also changed. Above here you can see something called a namespace. Now don't worry too much about namespace. I will explain that in a future video in the organization of your code. For now, I'm just going to rename this namespace, and I'm going to call it calculators. So all calculators that I may have in this library, I'm going to put in this namespace called calculators, right? And I'm going to add a simple method here. Now, again, if you don't know what a method is, don't worry. It's basically a function if you've written any other scripts. And I'm going to add a function that multiplies two numbers with each other. So I'm going to say public double, it returns a double type, multiply. And you can see in my Visual Studio, because I've got GitHub Copilot, the AI wants to do things for me, so it suggests what I can code. I'm just going to press tab to accept that. So this function is basically going to accept two numbers called one is A, one is B, and it's going to return the product of those two numbers, right? So this is now my calculator, and now I can go back. I'm going to close this file, and I'll close this file as well. So I've closed all my files, and what I want to do now is to create a reference from this app so that I can make use of this calculator which sits in my library. So as I said earlier, I'm going to right click on dependencies and I click on add project reference, and this window will open. Now it will show here at the top the projects that are in the current solution. Of course, I've only got one other project called My Library, but I just want to note that you can also browse on your computer and find any DLL that you want to link to your project. And there are some constraints about .NET versions, so you will not be able to link any DLL to your project, but generally you should not have problems there. But for this example, I'm going to choose to link, create a reference to the project called My Library. And if I unfold this now, you can see there's a reference to My Library. Now let's go into the program file and create and make use of that calculator. So I'm going to type in calculators. You can see it shows me that namespace, and within that namespace, so namespace is like a logical grouping of your code, and within that it gives me a calculator class. So I'm going to say a calculator, that is the name of the class, and the variable name is calculator, and I'm going to say equals new calculator. Alright, so now I've created an instance of that class. So I'm using a lot of terminology here that you may not be familiar with, such as an instance of, etc. If that's all strange to you, don't worry. I am going to discuss that in future videos. So now you can see that my GitHub Copilot is already picking up here that I can calculate a result, which is, for example, calculator multiply 2 and 3. But let's do it slightly more sophisticated. Let's create in our console application, let's prompt the user for two numbers and then we'll multiply them. So I'm going to say console right line, and I'm going to say enter a number, and then I'm going to read that. So I'm going to say I'm reading a type double, and I'm going to take the input from console, and because that will be read as text, .NET requires you to use strong typing. In other words, you cannot just convert one text to a number. You have to explicitly convert it, which is what this piece of code does. I'm going to convert this number to I'm going to convert the input from the console to this number A, right? And then I'm going to ask the user enter another number. I'm going to read that number. So you can see now I've got double B, and the answer here, I want to now multiply A times B, and then I get that the result of this calculated into this variable, and then I'm going to write to the user the result is, and I will display that. Let's run that and see. Right, so here I see hello world, enter a number, so I'm going to say 4, and enter another number, I'll say 3, and it says the result is 12, and the program has finished running. Okay, so that's a very quick breakdown of the way that you structure projects in Visual Studio and how they refer to each other. Now, once again, I want to ask, do not be concerned if this syntax looks strange to you and it looks confusing. It's a little bit like if you have just taken an aeroplane to Paris in France and you can't speak French, you don't know the language, you get off at the airport, initially everything is strange. So you are just going to find your way without necessarily understanding everything that is being said, but you will know enough to get going and get to your hotel. And you're going to spend more and more time in France, and after a year or two of practice, you're going to understand. So things will become much more understandable for you. You have to be patient. Learning a new language syntax takes a little bit of time, but it is not something that is very difficult for an engineer to master. Okay, so that's it for this video. In the next video, we will talk more about structuring your code in projects. We'll talk about files and the C# class, which we just touched on in this video. And then we'll also talk about namespaces, and finally about modifiers and the scope of variables. So the next video will be very important, foundational for your journey in C#. I want to give you a little bit of homework or suggested watching. If you are learning C#, the Tim Corey channel is very good. As I said in the earlier video, as engineers, if you are trying to learn .NET C# from scratch and you watch videos that are aimed primarily at professional programmers, many of the concepts that will be introduced in the videos will probably not be familiar to you. And so those videos may often not be at the place where you need to start learning. And that's what we're trying to achieve with this video series. But Tim Corey has an excellent channel, and I recommend that you watch his videos. And specifically, I think before you watch the next video, go and search for Tim Corey important project type C#, and you should find this video. It's just 13 minutes long, and it just will bolster and explain a little bit more what we've covered in this video. So thanks for watching. We'll see you again in the next video.